So thanks so much for the chance to present today. I'm talking about a project concerning the interaction between trade and inequality within a country. And this is joint work with Rodrigo Adao, Paul Carrillo, Arnaud Costineau, and Dina Pomerantz. So we're interested in, as I mentioned, this question of trade and inequality. We're going to sort of just analytically, we find it useful to think about that in two parts. Sort of first, who in your country of interest is exposed to trade? And second, kind of what's the incidence of those differences? That is to say, exposure might be irrelevant if there's no incidence, but it could be highly relevant if there is some incidence. By incidence, we just mean the usual economic incidence of sort of how a demand shifter will impact on the price, of the demand for that, of the price of that thing. Okay, so we're gonna start with what we think of as kind of a general yet hopefully simple enough to understand sort of factor supply and demand framework for thinking about those questions. The exposure side of the coin, we're going to split into two parts. Kind of what we're going to call an export channel of exposure and an import channel of exposure. I'll be more precise about those things, of course, as we go. And then when it concerns incidence, we want to just, a key basic point to get across is that, the factor price responses of a trade shock are going to hinge, on incidence, and they're going to hinge via incidence only on the elasticities of factor demand in the domestic economy. So, sort of everything to do with, we're going to cast things such that there's a sort of trade shock, which changes exposure. And then the implications of that for prices and hence inequality works through incidence, and incidence works through what the shape of domestic factor demand looks like. And I'll try to convey the intuition of that as we go. So then we'll turn to the data, and we're going to turn to the country of Ecuador. You could do this on any country, I think, where the data, where one thinks that the kind of the quote unquote right data is available. We're going to sort of design the model around the data that's available for Ecuador. And by the way, I gather that Chile might be one of the other countries in the world where exactly this notion of data and maybe better notions too would be possible. But okay, but the bottom line is we're going to sort of try to take every individual in Ecuador, at least every individual that we see in our data, that we see in the administrative tax data, that is, I should say, and try to measure their exposure to exports and imports separately. And the reason that's possible is that we just to state, I guess, the obvious. So you want to be able to sort of see how individual firms trade with the rest of the world, that is export or import, and that comes from firm level customs records. And then you want to be able to see how the firms who don't trade directly with the world nevertheless trade with the firms who do. And that comes from the VAT, kind of individual firm to firm records in the VAT data. And then you want to be able to link people to firms, the individuals that matter for inequality. You want to be able to link them to the firms. And that comes, we're going to have two types of people in a sense. We're going to have workers, and we link them to the firm via standard Social Security kind of records. And then also people who are capitalists, who are the owners of the firms, and we link them to the firms via like an ownership registry, basically, that tells you, in principle, almost like a matrix of all the firms in the economy and all the people in the economy and what share of every firm every individual owns. That's the idealized ownership registry in our minds. Okay, so then armed with those data, we can sort of, and the theory that suggests how to use those data, we're going to sort of combine our measures of exposure with an attempt to estimate what incidence looks like. And this basically, as I mentioned earlier, comes down to estimating what Ecuador's domestic factor demand system looks like. What are the elasticities of factor demand basically inside the domestic economy? What would they be in a closed version of that domestic economy, for example. So this comes down to kind of parameter estimation, basically elasticity estimation. So we're going to have a setting where the elasticities that matter are the ones that one can estimate at the micro level, sort of using firm level demands for factors and consumer level demand for firms and other firms' demand for the outputs of those firms. So those kinds of micro elasticities inside people's utility functions and inside the firm's production functions are what are going to matter. Of course, macro elasticities are what are really going to matter, and we'll sort of build up those macro elasticities using a combination of micro elasticities and all the micro shares of where all the firms and supply and demand is in the economy. Those are necessary to get to the aggregate factor demand elasticity. Okay, so along the way, we're going to pause to do what we're going to call a kind of test, a macro test. So this model is kind of estimated on the micro elasticities, as I mentioned, but we're going to use the macro implications. And so it's reassuring to confirm that the model does replicate at the macro level the responses to macro trade shocks that have been observed in the past. And that there's no kind of reason that was guaranteed. So we think of it as a meaningful test that should hopefully reassure one about the answers we're going to deliver when we turn to using the model in an out of sample purpose, which is what we'll do next, which is sort of trying to calculate the impact of trade on inequality in Ecuador. And we'll pose that as basically the classic kind of definition that trade economists use of what is the gains from trade is sort of the negative of the change in welfare that would occur if you took that economy to autarky. So of course, it's the same as going from autarky to wherever we are, whatever amount of trading we're currently doing. So let's define that as kind of the gains from trade. This is going to be about the gains in trade, but sort of the relative gains for trade for every individual in Ecuador. We'll do the same. We'll sort of ask how every individual's factor prices change as we go from autarky to the current trading equilibrium. And of course, if that impact on factor prices is differential across people, then trade will affect inequality because it'll, of course, affect relative factor prices, which will be our definition of inequality. By the way, I should stress, this is all about earnings inequality. That is to say, it's nothing to do with another channel for inequality, which would be kind of consumption inequality, that the goods that people consume throughout the income distribution might be different and the prices of those goods might be differentially affected by trade. We have no data on such consumption, so everything, if you want to give it a welfare interpretation, it's as if all the consumers have the same preferences. Then when we talk about relative earnings inequality changes, we're also talking about relative welfare inequality changes. But obviously, I'm not going to go that far. I'm just, whenever I say inequality, please just remember that I'm talking about earnings inequality. Okay, so anyway, our main findings that I'll build up to are that, we think that the gains from trade in Ecuador, that Ecuador is currently enjoying, you might say, relative to autarky, are accruing largely to the richest people in Ecuador. So that is to say, trade does, if you go from autarky to where Ecuador is currently trading, our model suggests that trade was a force for increasing inequality. It benefited the rich more than the poor, so it was a force for increasing inequality. And in terms of unpacking whether that's happening because of exports or because of imports in a particular sense that I'll make clear, we think it's mostly quantitatively happening through the import channel. And that surprised me a bit. I guess I expected that particularly when it concerns being able to measure who owns the firms, based on prior work, I guess I assumed that we would see that basically big firms are the ones who really benefit from exporting. That's classic Mellett's model prediction. And I guess I assumed that very few people own those big firms, and those people are the rich people. So in other words, I kind of assumed that the export channel would be pro-rich and would swamp everything else. But what we're finding is actually not that. And I'll try to explain to you how we get there along the way. Okay, so that's a one-slide summary of what I'll be talking about today. These 4 points.
Sorry, Dave, can you ask you a short question? I mean, I guess you're going to talk about this later on, but is it import directly consumption imports, or is it more like imports through firms that sort of reduces the cost or increases the quality of the goods that are produced locally?
Yeah, I'll talk about that, but the specific notion that we, so I'm going to start with a fairly general framework in which one, I wanted to convey a completely general message that it would be sort of, all the reasons through, and I'll get to that in a second. But when we get to the actual implementation that we pursue and that derives these results in number 4, it's a particular combination of both of the things you said. So that is to say, it's like imports as if coming directly into consumers' hands, and hence depressing their demand for other firms that compete with the goods that came in. And second, it will also be goods that come into a particular firm's hands, imported intermediates, and hence reduce the costs of those firms and makes those firms more competitive than the other firms. And so we're going to bundle those two effects kind of, slightly through a parameterization choice, but we're going to bundle those through effects so that they work through one common measure of import exposure. And that's, in other words, it bundles both effects, but through a common measure. And the reason that happens is partly because of a parameter choice we made. There are different parameter values under which those two distinct notions of import exposure would be not perfectly correlated with each other. And so you would need to keep track of both of them. So anyway, so for simplicity, in our baseline analysis, we have one notion of import exposure that combines both of the things you mentioned.
Sorry, Dave. Can I make a question? I was thinking, well, you obviously have a very detailed administrative data set, but probably in Ecuador, informal entrepreneurs and informal workers must be a huge part of the inequality, right? Because in Latin America, to be in the formal sector is already to be some sort of privilege, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, we're just to state one obvious point, we're interested in how trade changes inequality. So, the key question is going to be, is not just, is there inequality across formal versus informal, but does the trade shock happen to change one of those more than the other, basically. Anyway, so that's just to frame the discussion. That's an important point to remember. But yeah, so I'm gonna, I'm sorry, this will take a while, but I'll eventually get to an extension that we've added to the paper that basically, tries to combine the information that we get from the administrative data with information that we can get from labor force survey data from Ecuador that tracks both the formal part of the economy and the informal part, and has like a flag basically for every person in the survey about whether they're formally engaged or informally engaged. So under some assumptions that I'll have to kind of state later closer to the time, there's a coherent way to combine those two pieces of information and hence fold the informal sector into our analysis. It turns out that basically strengthens everything I'm saying. It enlarges the import channel, and so it enlarges the overall effect. So it doesn't overturn anything. It just kind of strengthens the fact that trade appears to increase income inequality in Ecuador. Okay, so just very briefly on related work. Obviously, this is like a classic huge topic. I'm not going to be able to coherently discuss even just more than just a tip of the iceberg of that work. But one point that I do want to sort of flag is that we're particularly kind of inspired by, I guess you could say, and related to what a very canonical approach to the question of trade and inequality, which goes by the name of the factor content approach. This was kind of big in the 90s, you could say. So, the theory originally by Deirdre Steger, and then a whole host of applications by labor economists who were studying why inequality was going up in countries like the US and wanted to know, well, how much of what we see is due to trade they turned to the Deodorf-Steger theory, which was the factor content approach. I'll explain the details of that more in a second. And this exactly when and where one can use this theory, you know, what are its limitations, what questions does it answer and not, was the subject of a kind of famous debate in the 2000 issue of the JIE by Krugman, Lemur, and Deardorff. And so it's kind of been a classical approach that's been known to have some limitations. And part of what we see as the contribution to this paper is, you know, providing a number of extensions to that classical approach to make it applicable under weaker circumstances, you could say. And also, of course, applying it to kind of better data, we might say, so to much more granular data. The typical applications of this data in Katz and Murphy or Borjas, Freeman, Katz basically had, you know, kind of two types of workers, whereas we see the entire set of workers and capitalists, just as one example. So anyway, so I'll make a number of additional points about that, but I want to make that high-level connection clear. The second is, you know, one thing we learned while working on this is that some of the recent empirical work that has run regressions that are interested in how trade affects inequality across local labor markets, for example, in Brazil, the work of Brian Kovac, you know, suggests a particular notion of exposure that one could regress kind of wage changes on in order to estimate incidence. So that's a little bit like what we're doing, except for, of course, our measures of exposure will be different, will be more general, and our measure of different types of workers will be more general, and our measure of incidence is not as, because of the fact there's many different types of workers, studying incidence is not as simple as running one kind of simple cross labor markets regression. But we're trying to, you know, in a sense, build on some of the ideas in that earlier work. Okay, so turning now to the theory. So we're going to start general, and then to make a number of points that we think are most maybe easy to understand when you see their generality, and then turn to kind of like a specific parametric version of this general model that is the one we're going to then try to estimate and connect to the data. Okay, so this model will have two countries. That's without loss. We're interested in one of them, and you're not interested in the rest of them. And so we'll call the home country the country of interest. So there's an arbitrary number of factors. I'll index those by little f. Each of them is in fixed supply. That's not essential for any of these points. It's just you know, a useful piece of notation, you might say. So let's call that exogenous fixed supply L bar. Okay, so then in this economy, the main assumptions are going to be about the way the economy works will be as follows: that factor markets are perfectly competitive, meaning all agents are taking factor prices as given and deciding what to do. Those factor prices we'll call W, a vector there. And then this second thing I'm about to say turns out not to be necessary at all, but is very nice for the exposition, which is that in addition, let's assume that the goods markets are perfectly competitive too, meaning that consumers and firms take the prices of domestic goods, P, as given. So again, that's not necessary for the results. It's in any sense. It's just, but it is very nice for the notation. So let's kind of run with it. So finally, there'll be these foreign goods. No idea what they are, but there's an arbitrary vector of them and selling for price P star. Okay, so then you know, finally, everything is easier under the case of kind of constant returns to scale technologies. You know, increasing returns to scale brings in imperfect competition. It's not impossible, but that's the extension I'm going to leave out. Decreasing returns to scale, of course, as usual, is just really an assumption about what the factors are. So so that's also in that sense without loss. All right, so then so here comes a kind of substantive result that sort of took us a while to prove, one could say, and is not as trivial as it might look, but hopefully it's very intuitive, that there is a coherent notion, coherent in a sense I'll make precise in a second, but there is a coherent notion of the home country's own demand for any factor. So in particular, one of the home factors. So this notation on the left here is meant to invoke a function. Okay, so it's to say, you know, the value demand, that is the price times the quantity that the home country wants to demand of factor F at a given vector of factor prices in this domestic economy, and at a given arbitrary value of the price of the foreign goods given by P star. So this is a function. So obviously you'd put the P star in. Let's imagine the foreign economy gives us a P star, and then now it's a classic like labor demand function, right? At the aggregate level, it says the entire economy will demand an amount of this factor at a given vector of factor prices in the economy. Okay, so you'll notice that what's kind of missing here from the usual notion of factor demand would be aggregate factor demand would be the price of goods. So obviously that's been substituted out. We've gotten rid of the price of domestic goods, P, by always writing those. This is the part that you kind of need a kind of non-substitution theorem to prove, but always writing out those domestic prices, goods prices, as a function of factor prices and foreign prices for goods. Okay, anyway, so when that all said and done, you get a very intuitive way of writing this domestic factor demand as the following kind of three-way product of functions. So the first is just the sort of how much each firm is demanding, each domestic firm is demanding of the domestic factors at those factor prices and foreign goods prices. Second is the Leontief inverse matrix across all those firms. So that is, of course, going to convert the direct factor demand in A into the total direct plus indirect factor demand including the Leontief inverse. And then final, there's the the actual final demand for the goods that the domestic firms make. Okay, so by contrast, the factor content of exports looks very similar. So, that's a classic idea going back to Leontief. What is, this is a classic thing that many people would compute, which is, what is the factor demand of Chile's export? What is the factor content of exports of Chile's exports right now? And that's what this notation is meant to invoke. So, of course, what that really is the value of factor F inside Chile, let's say, being demanded by foreigners. So we call that thing L star. It's like the star demand, the foreign demand for factor F. So here it's not a function, because if there were a function, we wouldn't need to use it. So what this notation is just meant to invoke, it's the actual observed factor content of exports at the time of trading that you're observing. Okay, so that notation, that's meant to mean, ET, this is the vector of firms' exports at trading equilibrium kind of T. And then A and B are the, the direct and indirect use of factors among all the firms, again, in the trading equilibrium. So the key thing that I'm trying to invoke here is that the top here is a function. It would hold for any W and any P star. And the bottom thing, this is an observable object that you observe kind of in one trading equilibrium. Okay, so armed with those definitions, this is the useful lemma for everything that follows. It says that, again, it's going to look trivial. I guess once you've established this, it is. So it says the following, that if WT is a trading equilibrium factor price vector, and at trading equilibrium P star, meaning the prices that the foreigners are offering, or whatever that's happening, then the factor demand from the domestic economy for every factor is going to have to equal, in a sense, the amount of factors that are left over for them to demand, if you like. So what is left over? Well, remember, there's the exogenously given amount of the factor L bar, and then L star is kind of how much of that factor is getting, in a sense, sent abroad, kind of not available for domestic use. That's L star, that's the factor content of exports. So of course, hopefully this is intuitive. You take the initial factor supply, you subtract off the amount being exported, and that's the amount left for the home economy to consume. And it's that amount left that is going to have to clear the factor markets and hence pin down WT, the factor price. All of that at a given vector of P star. Okay, so in a picture, all we're saying is this basically that kind of arbitrary, at least subject to the constant returns assumption I mentioned, preferences, technology, and goods markets assumptions leads to, in a sense, a world demand curve for the factors in your economy. So let's take two of those factors and plot them, factor F and factor 0, just like a reference factor. So this is the relative price against the relative quantity of those two domestic factors. And the black downward sloping line is just the world demand. So, and of course, world demand is like domestic demand, LF, plus foreign demand, LF star. Okay, so then, of course, we're saying the factor market equilibrium has to be where relative world factor demand equals relative world factor supply. Relative world factor supply is super easy because these two factors are both in fixed supply, so their relative amount is also in fixed supply, and that's, of course, why the supply curve is upward sloping here. Okay, so then in terms of making more notational organizational progress, let's kind of rewrite this result in the following way. This is just trivial, relabeling, redefinitions, but it's useful for what follows. So let's kind of, instead of writing as this ratio of sums, let's write it as kind of, a product of two terms. So the first term is what we're going to call kind of relative domestic demand for these two factors. So let's call that RD, relative it should really be RDD, relative domestic demand, if you like it, but just it has no star on it, so it's about the domestic economy, RD. So of course that just says at these factor prices at P star, this is the relative amount that the domestic economy will consume of the two factors. And then the residual, if you like, is just sort of relatively speaking, how much of these two factors are being exported relative to how much they were in fixed supply. And of course, that's what this this kind of other part of the product is over here on the right. And we're going to call that thing relative export exposure, or REE. So again, this is kind of take a factor F, take it relative to some base factor, reference factor, factor 0. And what we're saying is that we can split up this demand curve into the product of the RD bit and the REE bit, how much they're being relatively exported. Okay, so why bother with that? Well, it allows us to define these import and export channels I mentioned earlier. So, to fix ideas there, you can imagine that since the factors are in fixed supply, everything that could impact factor prices is all about moving the demand curve, right? It's all about how much will a given shift move the demand curve, and that'll just slide you right up the factor supply curve. So in math, that's like saying that the price of a factor relative to a reference factor, let's say, is going to be the inverse, the argument of the inverse relative demand curve, because we're kind of going from the x-axis to the y-axis. That's where the inverse comes in, of course. Of that relative demand curve evaluated, inverse relative demand curve evaluated at a quantity that is given by not the, not just the relative supply that would be valid in a closed economy, but the sort of the exporting adjusted relative supply. So it's this REE adjusted relative supply. That's the first argument of the RD inverse function. The second argument will be P star, the price of foreign goods. That could also shift this relative demand curve for the relative home demand curve, and that could matter for inequality. So these two shifters are what we're going to call the export channel and the import channel in the following sense. So let's first talk about the export channel. Sorry, this is a little screwed up. Just focus at the top on the bit that says the export channel. So, so what we're doing here in this picture is going from the trade equilibrium shown in black to the autarky equilibrium shown in red. And what we're invoking when we do that is these two shifters. So so the figure shown in black is what you've seen already. It's the inverse relative demand curve evaluated at P star, and where the supply point of evaluation that matters is this exporting adjusted relative supply vertical line. Okay, so the export channel is what we're going to define as sort of anything that can be written as a shift in relative export exposure. And the reason for that is that, it's very natural in this literature to think of things that basically, channels through which trade affects inequality merely or purely because of the fact that at the end of the day, you're saying that there's two different factors, two different people, let's say, that are differentially exported, or in a sense, their goods are being differentially in demand abroad. Okay, so this is really just saying that, kind of the foreign relative factor demand is different from the domestic factor demand. That by definition implies that REE is not one. And so great examples of this would include, for example, Eric Verhoeven's QJE paper on how trade affects inequality in Mexico, where he argued that, a bit like maybe Federico was observing earlier, that there are firms in Mexico that sort of specialize in making goods for the export market. Maybe they make higher quality versions of the same goods that they sell at home. And Eric argued that making those higher quality versions of the same good requires higher skilled workers. And so there, just immediately you get REE bigger than 1 for skill relative to unskilled workers. Why? Well, just because it's the case that, like, when that economy exports, they're exporting high quality things. Those high quality things embody the skills of the high skilled workers. And so that necessarily has to imply that REE is bigger than 1 for skill relative to unskill. It's kind of as simple as that. Okay, so the export channel will define as just, the kind of setting REE to 1, which in our picture here involves shifting the black curve to the black vertical line to the red vertical line, and just evaluating the change in wages, relative wages, that occurs purely because of that. So in other words, you're sliding up the black relative domestic demand curve to this kind of point where the red vertical crosses the curvy black. That's going to be the export channel effect on relative wages. So the import channel does the next shift, which is going to be, as it says here, set P star to infinity. So why infinity? Well, obviously we're saying that, without loss, you can think of autarky as a place where the price of foreign goods is infinite, right? That's sort of by definition what autarky is. Of course, many of those goods would have stopped being imported before infinity, but without loss, we can just set it to infinity. Okay, so that could shift factor demand too, and that's what's shown in this picture. The red curvy line shifts to the black curvy line shifts to the red curvy line, and it shifts exactly because of the fact that there's an import channel. That is to say, when you evaluate domestic factor demand under P star less than infinity, you get the black curve. When you evaluate it under P star equals infinity, you get the red curve. So, of course, it could be the case that the P star changing does not affect the domestic relative demand curve. In fact, all of the papers mentioned up here under the export channel have that feature. They all have an export channel and actually don't have an import channel, meaning to say that as P star changes, the relative domestic demand for any two factors does not change. However, you can easily write down models where it does happen, that when P star changes, the relative use of demand for two factors at home does change. And good examples of that would include, not just the classic Stoper-Samuelson mechanisms, but maybe more simply, let's think of Burstein, Kerfino, Vogel. That paper, argues that a major thing that is imported into a lot of countries, maybe Chile is an example of this too, is kind of basically goods that embody capital. And so to the extent that we think that two domestic factors are differential substitutes in production for capital, like, for example, Crucell, Ohanian, Rios Rule, Violante, for example, a classic paper on, capital growth having implications for skill inequality. To the extent that that's true, of course, as this country imports more capital, it will be the case that, two domestic workers will be differentially affected merely because they are differential substitutes for capital inside the production function of the economy. So that would be what we'd call an import channel, not an export channel. And just to be clear, it's very possible to have, it might sound impossible to actually engineer shocks that do an export channel and not also an import channel. The trade economists in the room are probably thinking, what about Lerner symmetry? What about the balanced trade? What about the fact that if I shut down exports, I also have to shut down imports under autarky? That's an important observation, but it's not quite right for these discussions because we're focusing on relatives here. So, setting REE to 1 is very easy to do in an open economy. You're not shutting down exports, you're shutting down the relative amount the two workers are exporting their factor services. And so no surprise, that's why all these papers down here actually don't have an export channel. They have RE equals to 1 always. And yet they have a perfectly coherent, kind of pure balanced trade discussion of a pure import channel. So anyway, the two shocks are kind of completely separable in that sense. Okay, so those are our definitions.
Dave, can I ask you a short question?
Of course,
so,
yeah.
I might have misunderstood, but I thought you said at the beginning that so you have this sort of fixed supply of factors, and that was without loss. But like, say you want to take into account, like, endogenous accumulation of, say, human capital or physical capital, and how that would potentially also respond to these shocks. And so this vertical line would be sort of more like a lower slope, would allowing for that. I guess, yeah, I want to see your reactions to a setup in which you allow for that to be responding to the shock.
Yeah, that so I guess, like, one cheap answer is that, like, I think it's the case that we can always define the factors as something that's in fixed supply. So, classic thing with endogenous human capital accumulation would be defined like that kind of kid's, that kid has 24 hours a day in which to, like, either work or accumulate human capital. So, but the 24 hours in the day are fixed, and that's the thing that is in fixed supply. Obviously, that's a classic trick for studying the labor-leisure aspect of endogenous factor supply. Another one that is natural is to think about a Roy model, where people, in a sense, every individual is endowed with two factors, their ability to do job one and their ability to do job two. And they have a constraint on their time that means they can't do both at the same amount of time. That's, again, just the same as a fixed supply model, but when you map it to people, you have to acknowledge that a given person owns two factors. So anyway, so I think there's, at some very deep level, this is without loss, but obviously when it comes to mapping the intuitions to the real world, we often don't do this. Those tricks, we often gravitate to a world where you replace this figure on the screen now with an upward sloping factor supply curve. And doing so would not substantially change anything we're saying in this part of the paper. In a sense, you'd have to replace the domestic RD curve with sort of like a like a curve that is like, that sort of, in a sense, folds together the fact that the RD curve is up in this figure is upward sloping, and the RS curve being upward sloping too. Obviously, it's kind of a matter of incidence. We're going to shift the RD curve, and the question is how much will wages change? That's obviously very easy to talk about when the supply curve is vertical, but it's not that much harder to talk about when the supply curve is upward sloping. You just need to take into account the elasticity of that factor supply.
Exactly, but the issue is to kind of take into account that you need to estimate that slope as well.
Of course, you would need to know it. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
But that's something you won't allow when you take it to the data.
Yeah, so exactly. So as it happens, when we go to the data, we're going to fix factor supply, which I agree might be a substantial limitation, especially in the longer run. Obviously, we're studying capital, so you mentioned human capital accumulation. There's also, of course, good old-fashioned capital accumulation that we don't have. Yeah. Okay, so sorry. I'm gonna just very briefly connect this to the original factor content approach. That's a special case of everything you just saw. No surprise, because the what you just saw was fairly general. But the key thing about it being a special case is that they're going to make the classic Heckscher-Samuelson assumption that that all goods in your domestic economy are purely import competing, meaning that if a domestic firm were to change their price by epsilon, then they would go out of business because imports would flood in, and consumers would buy those goods instead. So that's, of course, the classic thing that happens inside the cone of diversification in a no trade cost identical technologies Heckscher-Lean model. And the implications of all that for the picture you just saw is basically just that the RD curve is going to be perfectly horizontal under those assumptions. The intuition is that at those finite P star foreign prices inside that Heck-Sherlin cone of diversification, if the factor prices at home were to deviate even slightly, then we would lose all demand for those factors because our firms would lose all the demand for their goods, basically. Okay, so the cool implication of that assumption that Deodorff-Sager spotted is that now you can kind of do a very simple kind of two-step approach to studying the effect of trade and inequality. And this is what people like Katz and Murphy ended up applying. So it starts the same place as before, and you want to go to the autarky point as same as before, but you do a different two-step. You notice that it turns out in that model, thanks to the fact that the RD curve is horizontal, you can sort of move to what you might call an autarky adjusted as if factor supply point that is different than the one we're stressing, which involves moving to the left, turning off REE. In this picture, you'd move to the right and you turn off something different, which is the relative net export exposure. So net meaning, kind of critically, that you take how much of a given factor is being exported, that's directly visible in the data in principle, a la Leontief, and you subtract off how much of that factor is being imported. And you can see that that is inherently a little bit difficult because, we can measure how much firms in our economy are exporting the factors in our country, but to figure out how much the consumers in our economy are implicitly importing goods that embody factors that are as if identical to the factors that are in my economy is not directly visible in any data set, right? It involves the assumption that which factors abroad are perfect substitutes in world production for the factors at home. Okay, so measuring the factor content of imports is hard, but if you're willing to kind of figure out how to do it, then the classic approach would say kind of make that correction, and then finally kind of slide up the domestic autarky, that is the same RD inverse at P star equals infinity curve that we stress, slide up that and get back to the autarky point. So in other words, it has this feature, this very intuitive idea that studying inequality, how trade affects inequality, is the same as studying how much those, under the Heck-Sherlin assumptions, is the same as studying how much our country's net export-import vector embodies the factors that compete with domestic factors. Or augment the demand for domestic factors. Okay, so the final point that we think is important to remember about this, and has, in our understanding, not been applied correctly in previous empirical practice, is that the way you would do this in the second step is slide up this red line, and that involves estimating the factor demand system in the autarkic economy, right? It's not the domestic economy, like it's not the open economy RD curve. That thing actually has a known elasticity by assumption of infinity. Instead, you want to slide up the finite elasticity red one, and knowing what that elasticity is not easy. In other words, you cannot go to an open economy and just estimate that thing the way Katz and Murphy, for example, did. Okay, so in other words, there's a little bit of a misconnection between theory and practice in the application of this idea, even under the assumptions that are often invoked. Okay, so now let's go to this kind of the more parametric model that is going to be a special case of everything you just saw. And the main thing about this is that this will be something that can be more easily estimated using the data we have, and in particular, including the micro aspects of the data we have. So that is to say, in other words, in principle, you could apply these propositions. All you would need to know is the shape of the red RD curve. Basically, that's all you need to know. So in principle, you could try to estimate that thing. You'd go to your economy in autarky. Maybe that's not possible. And you do aggregate factor demand estimation, a la something like Katz and Murphy, which, is often inherently challenging because the only variation that exists in that data is over the time series. So you need to find a closed economy that then, for which you have a long time series. Okay, so for those reasons, direct estimation of the RD curve, while in principle attractive, in practice is kind of hard to do and rarely done. And when done, not done appropriately, we would say. That's the point I tried to make here. So we're not going to try to do that either. We're going to instead, write down assumptions under which the variation in the microdata that you see in your domestic economy, whether it's open or closed, is the right, it allows you to build up to the red RD inverse at autarky kind of line. Okay, so this will involve parametric assumptions that we're just going to kind of make and then relax some of them as I get towards the end of the talk. Okay, so the first things on that will be preferences, fairly standard. We're going to say that there are these things called sectors indexed by K, and at that across the sector level, consumers have Cobb-Douglas preferences across the sectors. And then within each sector, the consumers have CES, more general CES with elasticity sigma demand preferences across all of the firms in the world, in principle, for those goods inside each sector nest. So this elasticity sigma that I'm putting in blue here will be really important. And why? Because it basically governs consumer substitution across firms. All right, so turning to those firms, they're going to have technologies that work as follows. Very sort of fairly standard, but I'll admit restrictive production function assumption here. So this firm N produces at a quantity Q of its good, whatever that is, with an arbitrary TFP, and then a Cobb-Douglas production function involving labor and material. Oh, sorry, L meaning all primary factors, a vector of them that I'll describe in a second, and a bundle of materials that it wants to buy. So Cobb-Douglas preferences for labor versus for factors versus materials. Then the materials bundle will itself be a Cobb-Douglas combination in our baseline of all the firms in the world, basically. So this part has all the domestic firms in it, and this part here has all the foreign firms in the world in it. So, for example, one thing we relax later in the paper is this Cobb-Douglas assumption, which one could imagine could matter. All right, so then finally turning to the other part of the upper production function, this bundle L of factors. So that one will be CS, and more general than Cobb-Douglas CS with an elasticity eta. So this is a kind of within the firm, the firm substitution between, for example, capital and labor, or between capital and labor of type 1 and labor of type 2, that kind of thing. CES in the baseline, and then later on we consider more nested versions of this thing where it's like the elasticity of substitution between capital and all labor is different than the elasticity of substitution between labor of type 1 and labor of type 2. But for now, this is one primary factor elasticity of substitution, which we'll call eta. So these two parameters in the baseline are all that's going to matter for elasticities. Sort of in some sense, every other elasticity is set to 1 because it's Cobb-Douglas. And then obviously all the shares will matter. Even if the elasticities weren't 1, all the shares would matter. But in a sense, it's because of Cobb-Douglas and all the fact that we're going to know all the shares are going to, of course, let us estimate these unknowns like, this shifter here, how much do consumers just like product N? This shifter here, what is the TFP of firm N? And all these shifters here, these parameters theta, which are, kind of just how much does firm N want to use the goods produced by firm R? All those things, because there'll be a very simple way to map those to the data to all the shares that we observe in the data. Anyway, but these two elasticities will turn out to be critical, theta and eta. Sorry, sigma and eta. All right, so now let's, in that model, define export exposure. But actually, this one, our definition of export exposure is the same one that I showed you earlier. So I remember earlier I defined something called REE down here, relative export exposure. So this will just basically be export exposure of factor F divided by export exposure of factor 0. So it's what's true in the general model is going to also be true in the parametric model. And we see that as kind of an important realization that, in some sense, export exposure in the general model and hence also in the special model is just sort of directly something you get from the data. It's directly observed. The model doesn't like tell you how to do it or anything. It's just directly sitting there in the data. Okay, so to be more precise about that, it'll be exactly the same sort of matrix of direct factor usage, the Leontief inverse matrix I previously called B in the trading equilibrium, and the direct firm level export vector I called ET in the trading equilibrium. as a normalization to make it interpretable across different types of factors, we'll divide by that factor's total factor earnings, just to sort of put it as like a share. So it's like the of the total spending on factor F in the world economy, what share of that is accounted for by foreign demand, where accounted for we mean both direct exports of that factor service to abroad and indirect exports of that factor service to abroad. All right, so one can do this for any factors, and in practice, we're going to do this for much more micro factors than is typical. And in addition, we're going to construct this using much more micro data than is typical, because this matrix, and this vector will all be firm level things, right? So firm level use of factors, firm to firm inverse, Leontief inverse matrix, and firm level export vector mean that the whole thing is not sort of fed through an aggregate IO matrix to be produced. It's, fed through the disaggregated IO matrix, if you like, to be produced. All right.
If you have 20 minutes to go.
Thanks. So then import exposure will be more complicated in the sense that it does rely on the model. And this gets back to the discussion I had with Federico earlier. So in this model, it turns out that, so if there were, remember in general, the import exposure is motivated by the fact that we're just asking how much that RD curve will shift when P star changes. You have an arbitrary vector of changes in the vector P star. So to motivate import exposure, let's imagine a uniform change in P star. So every foreign good of price P star, the entire vector is moving by a small but uniform proportional amount. So that's what this derivative is talking about here. So it turns out in this model, that derivative is equal to the following. So kind of sigma minus 1 times this thing that we'll call import exposure, or more accurately, import exposure of factor F relative to the whatever is your reference factor inside RD, that's factor 0. You need to kind of calculate import exposure in this relative way, of course. Okay, so what is import exposure in practice? So you kind of take a factor F that you're interested in, and you construct this sort of correlation, you might say, across all sectors and firms. Firms are just things inside sectors, where you're asking basically, what is, how much is my factor F used in the domestic demand of firm N? Not the foreign demand of firm N, but just the domestic demand of firm N. Because remember, we're trying to get the RD curve, not the kind of foreign demand curve. So how much is factor F used inside firm N? And then more critically, how much is firm N importing? This will be, crucially because of the kind of the reason that this matters is because when firms import, they're going to basically have cheaper, cheaper costs. They're importing intermediates. That means their costs will fall. That means that their price will fall because of pass through to the consumer. That means consumers will substitute towards them. And so because that substitution, remember the upper level was Cobb-Douglas, the cross-sector substitution doesn't matter. Consumers, in a sense, in shares don't substitute across sectors, but they do substitute within sectors. And so that's why sigma minus 1 is turning up here. And that's why this total import involvement of firm N is relative to the sectoral average. It's not just its absolute amount of importing. Okay, so if sigma is bigger than 1, which we think is a typical expected case, then import exposure here is, in this sense, going to be kind of bad for a factor. It means that you're relatively less exposed to a firm that is going to would get cheaper because of cheaper intermediates. Okay, so then let's put numbers on those two types of exposures I just showed you. So to do that, I'll turn to the data. This is this administrative microdata from Ecuador that I mentioned earlier. These are the years that we have that data for at the moment. So we're using them. Question?
Dave? Yes. Ernesto Bastian from the bank.
Hi.
Hi. I'm trying to think about where there is a way to get some sort of external validity of the assumptions, on the simplifying assumptions on the technology and preferences.
Yeah.
For instance, what are the Cobb-Douglas assumptions, which allow you to simplify a lot the math and get this beautiful different components, whether that has some implication of the relative share of sectors in domestic GDP or something as the economy gets open. And so those kind of things are things that probably we could go and check in the data later.
Yeah.
Not in terms of inequality, but in terms of aggregate effects.
Yeah.
Also, and then we can be confident that those assumptions that are very useful in terms of the math are also sensible assumptions in terms of the description of the data.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So we are doing a form of that, I'll call a test later. It's going to be a full test though, in the sense that it's going to, we're making a string of assumptions here that end up implying that the following trade shock will affect wages in the following quantitative amount. And we're just going to test that. So, let's call that a joint test of all of these Cobb-Douglas, like assumptions that we're making, including, of course, things like instantaneous adjustment. This is a static model that I'll just test period by period in changes. And of course, also the perfectly competitive factor in goods markets. That's a bit of a strong assumption too. So yeah, so it'll be a joint test of all that stuff. And then finally, on the Cobb-Douglas stuff, we have actually tried estimating, which would be the formal way of kind of relaxing them, relax and re-estimate. We've relaxed and re-estimated almost all of them, but actually I think not the one you just said, which is the sectoral Cobb-Douglas in demand. So that's
because
an interesting
something
one.
that I didn't want to interrupt you, because I understand the paper is long and you have a lot of stuff to cover. But something that made me very curious is about that you can get this inverse Leontief component. I work some different stuff, but also an input-output, and I find in my own work that getting an inverse Leontief described in the input-output effect does is true at very, very specific assumptions. It's not a general thing. I mean, inverse Leontief meaning I minus input-output, everything to the -1, to the power of the -1. That's what I mean.
Yeah, so obviously there's a classic thing about, can we measure that thing? Can we compute it?
Correct.
But more succinctly is like, is it structurally stable? Obviously under non-Cobb-Douglas it wouldn't be. In fact, in our model it isn't either, because we don't have we don't have Cobb-Douglas inside the primary factor usage inside the firm. So that in itself implies that that the Leontief matrix is not structurally stable as well.
Okay, but we can talk about more later. So
yeah, please.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so this combines the data on firms that I mentioned, alluded to earlier, with data on workers and how they match to firms in the formal sector, as you were right to point out, and then also this kind of civil registrar database that tries to map individuals to firms in terms of what shares they own. And we're going to call the people that own the firms, we're going to kind of call them capitalists, you might say. That is to say, we'll say that their earnings are the profits that the firms make. And that will be the return on capital in our model. But as an aside, any single worker firm we'll call a self-employed firm, and we'll actually code that up as labor, just as an assumption, rather than a single firm capital unit that doesn't use any labor. That only matters for where you put the income of those people, but we thought it was more appropriate to treat them as labor. Okay, so then finally there's the factors. So far I haven't defined what a factor is. Everything was just, pick the factors and then put it into the machinery I developed. So what we're going to do in practice, to start with at least, is the following. So we're going to sort of say that the labor types of factors are the following. There's basically 72 of them plus a residual. So the 72 will be one for each province of Ecuador times each of 3 education groups in Ecuador. Think about that as like, you have a college degree, you have a high school degree, you have neither, those 3 groups. So, so this is kind of skill times geography as our definition of labor factors. And then finally, when it comes to capital, we weren't sure how to similarly disaggregate this, if you even wanted to, but one thing that is important is, we think, is to distinguish oil capital from non-oil capital. So that'll just be the capital inside oil firms and the capital inside non-oil firms. Obviously, what we're thinking of there is that really a lot of the profits that the oil firms make is not a return on kind of capital that the owners put in, but more a return on like the resource in the land. that they happen to own, and assuming that that's perfectly substitutable with buildings and machinery didn't seem very palatable. And so this is like a simple way of keeping those two things separate. Okay, so this is export exposure across the income distribution. So in other words, we measure export exposure for every factor and then map that into individuals based on how, which individuals own which factors. I mean, that's important because in principle, somebody could be both a capitalist and a worker. In fact, lots of capitalists also earn labor at a firm. And so anyway, that doesn't matter for this picture. We're just mapping the factors to the individuals based on what they own. Okay, and so this is what I mentioned earlier as being a bit surprising to me. I expected that, especially when you account for capital income, which is what's shown in blue, that the rich would be much more export exposed than say the middle class or the poor. But in fact, if anything, it's a bit surprising that that export exposure is actually lower in the very top, that effectively says that it's not the case in Ecuador that the big exporting firms are owned by the rich. That's basically what this is saying. And I guess we should include indirect exporting when we say exporting firms. Okay, so turning to import exposure, this one is the opposite. It looks the same in the sense that the rich are lower than the poor or the middle class. But remember, import exposure is defined in this way in the sense that it's not good to be import exposed. You'd rather not be import exposed. That's for sigma bigger than 1, which is the case that we think is realistic and end up estimating. And so what we think is, at the end of the day, is going on here is that there are a lot of firms that import a lot of intermediates, and inside those firms, rich people do work and own those firms. And so it's as if, kind of importing in this economy is a force for augmenting inequality because of the fact that it's the sort of relatively sophisticated, high skill, owned by rich people, large firms that are doing the indirect and direct importing, which for us means low import exposure. Yeah.
Quick question: is there a way for you to split these figures into the direct and the indirect effects?
Yeah, we can do that.
That'd be interesting, actually.
Yeah.
Indirect does indirect means exposure through the input-output network or not?
Yeah.
Okay, then it'd be very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's been a couple months since I looked at it, but I'm pretty sure we put in the appendix some numbers about that, but I'll check later. All right, so now we have to estimate the elasticities. So the reason this is important is because conditional on all the shares that you see in your economy in this model, it's only those two elasticities that matter for everything, and so they're critical, right? And of course, that's natural. The substitution across factors takes place within firms, that's eta, and across firms via consumers substituting their demand, and that's sigma. All right, so we need to estimate those two things. So I'll be quick on this, I'm afraid, but the basic idea is you're just doing factor demand estimation to get eta and product demand estimation to get sigma. And the classic way to estimate that of a CES demand system is just to regress the share in logs on the price. And the coefficient should be 1 minus the elasticity, right? You need a fixed effect to account for the prices of other things that happen through the price index, but it's basically that. So we do this, in a regression pooling across all firms and years, and using, of course, you need an IV for this. We're using a shift share based IV that is based on trade exposure that is exposure to what we're going to kind of call export shocks and import shocks. Those are going to be a little bit like Hummel's in his AER paper, Hummel's et al. Did, where they're arguing that kind of global growth in the kind of purchasing of given varieties, 6-digit HS product varieties, is exogenous from the perspective of these firms in Ecuador. But firms in Ecuador are differentially exposed to producing and importing those varieties, and so they're differentially exposed to those shocks, and that's the source of the exogenated inside the instrument. Okay, so for ADA, we estimate a value that is not too far from Cobb-Douglas, but it's bigger, implying these things are substitutes, and it's in the ballpark of 2. And the paper discusses some extensions, alternatives of how you estimate that, which variation you use, etc. That tends to leave it in the ballpark of 2. Turning to sigma, remember this is consumer substitution across firms, very different. But same idea, you're basically just asking, how much are these firms selling to those consumers? That's the quantity demanded, as it were, regressed on the price that the consumers are paying for those things. And the elasticity, the coefficient should be the elasticity. One complication here is that price is not observed. We see factor prices, in a sense, that was entering the previous demand regression, but not these goods prices, because the administrative data doesn't have any such prices. But in this model, there's a way to sort of back that out in changes, you might say, which is all that matters for this regression, the one in changes. The intuition is that we do sort of see how factor prices and import costs prices, prices of foreign things, change. And via the assumptions we've made, we can map that via the kind of factor usage and the inverse Leontief matrix into what the change in prices should be under, I guess, perfect pass-through. Which is what we've assumed by assuming perfect competition as well. So anyway, so that's the idea of kind of observing now the price that the consumers are paying for these goods. And at that point, it's the same idea of IV estimation using a shift share based instrument based on firms' heterogeneous exposure to foreign shocks, both that will change how much they want to grow and also how much the prices of their imports change. And so estimating that via IV, we get another elasticity that's bigger than 1. As I promised, sigma bigger than 1 is maybe natural when studying consumer demand for firms, but not that much bigger than 1. This thing is 2. Again, kind of by coincidence, it's in the ballpark of 2. All right, so I can pause to kind of run.
Yeah, just briefly, did you try like doing or do you have enough power to do like heterogeneous elasticities for different sectors?
Yeah,
is that something you've tried?
Yeah, we discussed that in the paper, and I might get to it very shortly, but I think we kind of like discovered that we have the power in the sense of the instrument passes like weak instrument sort of rough criteria for something like kind of 4 or 5 large aggregations of sectors. But doing it within each of the 2-digit sectors that are what we're defining as sectors, basically for the median sector, our instrument is not strong enough. So I'll show you the results when you let the thing be heterogeneous later. So this test, I don't think I should spend time on this. Let me just suffice by saying that, this is a genuine test in the sense that you're feeding those same trade shocks we used for IV estimation at the micro level, but now into the macro economy and asking whether they successfully predict via the estimated inverse demand function how much wages should actually change. And that's not something we've used in the estimation, but surprisingly, it does pretty well. So if the test was working perfectly, all of these regressions would have a coefficient of 1. Different regressions are different fixed effects, basically isolating different types of wage changes. But we were reassured that they're all in the ballpark of 1. Formally, we never reject that they're 1. And yet the test does have power, meaning that if you were to stick in kind of wrong values of eta or wrong values of sigma, the test would fail. Those coefficients that are 1 at like the right values shown in red would start to, the coefficient would be now not 1, away from those correct values. And so if that means the macro test has some power. All right, so then finally, let's talk about incidence. So this is just a counterfactual exercise at this point. We're asking, what would happen to the factor prices, relative factor prices in Ecuador, if we were to go from the current trade equilibrium to a hypothetical counterfactual autarky case, or flipping it, from autarky to trade. And of course, in math, that's the same as, converting from, holding the RD function fixed, holding factor supply fixed at the L bar levels, Federico, as we discussed, but changing REE to 1 and changing P star to infinity. That would be the case if you're going from observed trade to autarky. So if you know the RD function, you can of course evaluate this function at those two hypothetical points where RE is 1 and P star is infinity. And that's the combined import and export channels. But you can also split it up, and that's what we're doing in this figure here. So the left is feeding only the export channel shock into the function, so setting RE to 1. As you can see, this actually would be a force for decreasing inequality. It affects the rich more than the poor. Or more than the middle class at least. But the import channel goes the other way. It's massively pro-rich. And it's not just pro-rich, but it's more pro-rich than the export channel was anti-rich. And when you add these two together, which is literally what one should do, just sum them, you get this effect, which is shown here. So this is in a sense the main point of the paper is to deliver this figure here. This tells you across the income distribution, across the 100 percentiles, how much will everybody's earnings be affected by a move to open to trade relative to some reference factor, which we're always taking to be the median factor, the one at the middle, the median income person. So anyway, as you see, it's roughly speaking the case that like across low versus middle class, there's not much action. But across low and middle relative to the upper class, there is a relatively big effect where the richest people are getting 10% richer than the median people as a result of trade, according to these calculations.
So in terms of interpretation, in colloquial terms, we usually tend to think that there are winners and losers of trade.
Right.
Here there are only winners, almost.
We don't know in the following sense that, everything that I've shown you is all about relatives, so this could be positively good for everybody. And I'm just showing you the relatives. It in principle could be bad for everybody. I think we can rule that out. That's probably impossible in a model like this with competition. But anyway, I'm not saying that there's not someone who is hurt, in an absolute sense. Of their wage relative to like the price index of the goods they consume, let's say. So we haven't, in a sense, set this up to calculate that. One can, however, and using the model we've set up, one can calculate the price index effect, and that thing is so big that it means that everybody does definitely win in absolute welfare terms. So that's not shown here, but that's something that we talk about in the paper.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I've talked about these. Okay, so it turns out that what we find is very different from what we would have found if we'd applied the original factor content approach. So what we find is in blue here, and what Deerdorf 2000, the slightly more generalized version of Deerdorf-Steger 88 would have found is shown in blue or green here. And as you can see, they're different both in magnitude and direction. And we didn't know that when we started this project, but it's and by the way, we're doing this one at a CS Katz-Murphy like parameter that's not their parameter, it's one that we estimated for Ecuador, but it turns out to be very close to Katz and Murphy's estimate in the ballpark of 2 for the aggregate factor demand system CES elasticity. Okay, so the remaining slides discuss sensitivity. I'll be very brief because I know I need to wrap up. The basic idea here is we're just kind of showing you those same pictures, but under different parameter values in this case. So here we're kind of trying higher and lower values for eta, higher and lower values for sigma. And as you can see, you can generate the same qualitative patterns, but with smaller or larger magnification of the result at the top. The blue here is always showing our baseline. The second type of sensitivity I won't have time to go into, but this is where I discussed kind of departing from the Cobb-Douglas assumptions. So, for example, we can estimate a parameter we call epsilon in the extended model, which is where you take the Cobb-Douglas production function, part of the production function for combining domestic versus foreign inputs, which previously that epsilon was assumed to be 1. Now we estimate it, and we get something actually pretty close to 1, like 1.08. And so there's a counterfactual here where we stick in That's the one shown here in light green at the bottom. We stick in that to the model and see how much it affects things, things like that. This, of course, also plays around with different nestings of inputs versus primary factors, and also capital versus labor primary factors, etc.
What about the intermediate inputs and the factors elasticity? I guess that would also Cobb Douglas, but you're not relaxing that here, no?
So the one that
I mean the upper tier, if you want. Right. I mean between like factors and I mean between L and M in your notation, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that one. I don't think we have that one even in the appendix. L versus M. Yeah, this one I'm calling new here is inside the domestic inputs bundle. There's a bunch of domestic firms. We previously assumed that was Cobb Douglas. Mu estimates something non-Cobb Douglas. It's a little higher than Cobb Douglas. But the one you're asking for is not shown here. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. We should look into that. I think in the original version of the paper, we ran a test that was like, if that thing is 1, then the following should be true. It's a bit like what Ernesto was suggesting, and it passed. So estimation is kind of the inverse of that. So I don't expect it to be very different from 1, but I need to go back and remember exactly what we did there. But
yeah, that's one place where you kind of think that elasticity might be actually lower than when, I mean, in other places people have found that. So that's one maybe. Yeah,
very good point.
Maybe it doesn't.
Of course, yeah. I don't. Yeah, I think. I mean, everything would be smooth around 1 for that parameter. So I'm not. The question is of magnitudes. If you estimate that it's 0.2, then quantitatively, how do the results change? Yeah. Okay, so so Federico, this is where we estimated 4 different sigmas. We kind of split up into large aggregations of sectors that we thought were sensible, and you get numbers that are kind of still in the same ballpark as 2. The paper discusses more about that, of course, but and then finally informality. This is where I'll stop, but this was a question I got earlier. So in this figure, more is happening than just informality, but if you compare the light green with the blue, you can see how our results change when we add the informality extension to the paper. So again, this uses the labor force survey data that in principle is a representative survey of all people who work, either self-employed or, all people who earn. So it includes in principle capitalists, self-employed people, and formal and informal engaged firm workers. But we're going to assume that the crucial assumption is, we're going to assume that every factor, like, low skilled labor in Quito, is there's the people who are currently working in the informal sector in Quito, and there's the people who are working currently in the formal sector in Quito. And we're going to assume that those people are both, perfectly substitutable versions of the same factor. So that is to say, there's perfectly elastic factor supply across the informal and the formal economy within a factor group. So anyway, we think that's one extreme, version. We don't think it's that unrealistic. That's just our prior. But anyway, when you do that, it does matter. As I said, this sort of magnifies everything. So you get now this kind of light green curve. We had to stretch the axes just to be able to show this. But as you can say, it's basically the same shape as the light blue that was our baseline. It's just magnified. And that's basically because the informal sector is not trading very much. And so it's just way less import exposed than the formal sector is, which drives our baseline. Okay, so I don't have time to discuss kind of how we can also use this exercise to decompose what's changed in the past, not just autarky, but to suffice it to say, it's discussed in the paper. All right, so just to summarize what I've been talking about, we've tried to sort of talk about how trade affects earnings inequality via both kind of new distinction, or not necessarily new mechanisms, but a new distinction of mechanisms, new definitions into what we're calling the export and the import channel. We think that's useful because it, at the very least, has the feature that the exported channel should, in principle, be easy to map to the data. And so it should not be something that people can really disagree about the size of. And then stressing exposure versus incidence, we've tried to stress that export exposure, import exposure are things that should be easy in principle to measure with the right data. Their incidence, however, is harder because it depends on all the elasticities in the economy, something one has to kind of estimate. But the punchline of us doing all that in Ecuador is the figures I showed you earlier. But basically, the upper half of the income distribution, particularly maybe the upper part of the income distribution, is the one that appears to have enjoyed the largest share of the gains from trade in the case of Ecuador, meaning gains from trade going from autarky to wherever Ecuador is like now, those gains from trade. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Great, thanks a lot, Dave. We have some minutes for more discussion, so if you have any questions or comments, please give it away. You can open your mic.
So Ernesto here again. So sorry, could you spend 1 minute more on the informality? So the fact that there is the higher amplification on the upper part of the distribution, that doesn't mean that the data say that there are a lot of informality in the upper part of the distribution?
No,
Is that weird? No?
It does not say that. So in a sense, so one thing to remember about this figure is that everything is relative.
Yes.
So every line in every one of these figures is always drawn, like by definition has to be drawn, such that that there is some reference factor that's always the same. So the lines don't cross, but the dots do. The lines are just the best fit line. The dots are the actual people at each income distribution. And as you see, the dots at the 50th percentile of all the colors always lie on top of each other, kind of by definition. Okay, so anyway, what that means is that every other dot is to be interpreted relative to the 50th percentile person. Okay, so what I think is going on is that in the case of informality is that, you're right, there are not many people who are rich and informally engaged in the survey data. However, the import exposure effect that we stressed earlier that does favor the rich, the formally engaged, people who are also rich, that in a sense relative to the median person now gets magnified by the fact that the median person is likely to be, relatively likely to be informally engaged and hence not import exposed.
Okay.
That's
okay.
That's
okay.
our. I should say, I mean, we're making the assumption that it's driven by data limitations, but in some sense, this is a fully coherent, model that we describe in the appendix in detail. But the model that includes the informality sector. But in some sense, we are missing a bunch of data ingredients. So, for example, we know the workers inside the informal firms because of the labor force survey, but we don't know what those firms, who they sell to, right? So we assume that that the informal firms don't import directly and don't export directly. I think that's, apart from smuggling issues, I think that's okay, because in principle, the customs data should be the universe of all importing, and there's no informal firms by definition in that data. But the indirect part, is more made up, I'll be honest, because we don't know for sure that the informal firms are not like indirectly importing a whole bunch. We're assuming that they're not. Anyway, so that's why we say that the import exposure sort of has the same shape as before, except now exacerbated by the fact that the informal people are not at all import exposed, and they tend to be in the lower half of the income distribution. So that's essentially why it magnifies everything.
And that's why, coming back to this quick suggestion of splitting the effect between direct and indirect effects,
yeah,
in this particular context will be very useful.
Right. Yeah.
Because suppose that the direct effect for formal and informal is similar, but it's really what is driving the result is the informal part. Sorry, not informal, the indirect effect.
Yeah.
Then we will have more reasons to try to look at this, dig more on this, versus if the main difference comes from the direct effects.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Yeah, and more to the point that you're making, I think it'd be wonderful if there were countries, I don't think this is possible in Ecuador, but where the surveys of the informal firms tell you something about how much they, who they buy their materials from, and whether those materials are plausibly imported. In other words, whether those firms are indirect importers. Of course, indirect exporters is another important channel. So, yeah.
Dave, can I ask you something small? So I guess going back to the supply, the factor supply. Sorry for pushing on this, but you were doing like this, this disaggregation, like 70 something labor markets, if you want, or sort of factors, right? Like I guess one issue there is like the finer you go, the more problematic the assumption is, right? So have you tried doing this sort of just at the 3-level education you had? Because there maybe you might think that the assumption is not so bad at that point. Or whether you have thought about allowing for an upward sloping sort of not infinite labor supply curve of factors. Factor supply curve.
So on the second suggestion, we haven't done it, but my impression is that it would be pretty easy to do. Like, you, as I alluded to earlier, imagine just to relate to the first comment you made. I mean, maybe you're saying, you like the fact that people's education matters and is fixed, let's say, but you don't like the fact that their geography is fixed. So you'd like to sort of replace the inelastic geography supply with one extreme would be perfectly elastic geography supply. I'll come back to that, but I guess an intermediate version would be like, a finite elasticity of geography factor supply, i.e. kind of a migration elasticity that's not zero or infinite. My understanding is that would be relatively easy to add to the code. Obviously you need to know that elasticity. People estimate it. It's often low. Obviously, we put in the geography as our baseline, partly because we're inspired by the kind of evidence from places like Brazil and the US and Germany, and I'm sure other places too, that tends to find that you do see wage effects in a location based on locational shocks, which is inconsistent with perfectly elastic factor supply across regions. And when you look at changes in migration as a result of these shocks, at least in the typical kind of short medium run, you tend to find very small migration responses. Anyway, so yeah, I think it would be feasible, but we haven't done it. What we have done is the one where you set the elasticity to infinity, where you make the geography component not part of the definition of factors. I don't think we report that in the final, the version of the paper that's online. But I know we've run it, and I recall it having very qualitative and quantitatively similar patterns to what you see on these slides here. Let me see if I can dig that up, but that's my recollection. And we sort of left it out of the paper. So so the other two that are shown here are just where we change the education groups. So, like a natural question is why 3? Why not 2? Why not college versus non-college? Why not, high school versus non-high school? Those alternatives are the red and the green that are shown here. As you can see, that doesn't matter a whole ton. We can't do something different than the 3 because these 3 groups are the finest we see. I'm sure in Chile one could do a lot better. But.
Okay, great. I guess we have 1 more minute for a final question, if there's anyone interested. Okay, so let's leave it up to here. Dave, thanks a lot for your time again and for this great presentation. It was super interesting and super fun. Thanks everyone for attending this week's webinar. We'll be in touch for next week's webinar, so stay tuned. And thanks very much. And Dave, we'll see you in a couple of seconds in the practice session again. Bye, everyone.